welcome to our Soulcast Media event. We are so excited to be back here sharing some thoughts when it comes to how to elevate your communication skills and how to stand out in the workplace. For those of you who are joining for the very first time, I want to say welcome. My name is Jessica Chen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Soulcast Media, and we are a communications training company. I'm also author of the book Smart, Not Loud: How to Get Noticed at Work for All the Right Reasons. I started putting together these events, gosh, it's been a few years now. And I feel so fortunate to say that we've invited so many fantastic guests on where we talk about all things how to accelerate your career. And for those of you who are meeting me for the first time, I want to say communications is one of those skills where I feel once you learn how to become that impactful speaker, it can completely transform your career. It's also why I'm so excited to invite a special guest to our show today, where we're going to be talking about how you can think about the way you show up at work and how you can make work fair. It's a little tip, a little hint on what we're going to be talking about today. So, with that, I'm excited to bring up my guest. My guest is Siri, and she is a senior researcher at Harvard University and co author of the book, which I just teased, Make Work Fair. For those of you who are like, that's an interesting book. That's an interesting concept. Well, we are going to be diving into so many things about it. But first, Siri, I know I did a quick intro of who you are and the work that you do, but please introduce yourself and let us know what is it that you do?
Thank you, Jessica. It's such a pleasure to be on, and thank you, everybody, for listening. So, as you mentioned, I am a researcher at Harvard University, specifically at Harvard Kennedy School at the Women and Public Policy Program. And I study ways to make work more fair for everybody. So, concretely, things like how could we run our meetings differently? How could we send emails differently? How could we hire, evaluate performance, and promote people better and more objectively to ensure that work is genuinely a level playing field where everyone gets an equal chance to do their best work and succeed to their full potential. That is what my life is spent on studying. And I'm very passionate about sharing the things that we learn, the knowledge and the insights that we generate through all this research. So I also work directly with organizations, both to conduct research, but also to do speaking events, to consult with them, to advise them. And as you mentioned, I recently co authored with my colleague Iris Bennett at Harvard our new book, which is called Make Work Fair: Data Driven Design for Real Results.
Oh my gosh. I'm so well, first of all, Sarah, I mean, congratulations.
Oh,
It's
thank
no
you. You too.
it is no easy task to publish a book. And for those of you who don't know, so Sarah and I were also friends. We got lunch or no, dinner in LA a few weeks ago. And you and I, we were just kind of like chit-chatting about how like, oh my gosh, like, getting a book out there into the world is just crazy and it's exciting. And my book came out not even a year ago, and yours came out about 3 months ago or so earlier this
That's
year.
right.
And I mean, I just have to ask, like, how does it feel? Like, how does it feel first, having your book out there in the world?
It feels incredible because, as you know so well, Jessica, it's such a labor of love. You work on it behind the scenes for 2, 3 years, and yours is in my case about 2.5 years before it actually enters the world. But I think for me, at least, this part of the process is by far the most rewarding, which is the book is out there and you're getting to engage with people around the ideas. Because that, at least for us, was why we wrote the book in the first place. Is we wanted to share these ideas, hopefully provide people an actionable roadmap for how to actually do your daily work a little bit better, a little bit differently. And starting now to get the feedback from folks on, what's resonating, what are they most excited about, what changes have they made already that they're starting to see results from in their everyday life. Um, it's so rewarding.
Oh my gosh, there's so much that I want to dive into, and we're going to be sharing so many tips. And I know your book has a lot of frameworks as well. But before we dive into that, I want to ask you, what was the idea behind writing this book? And there's
Mm.
always that kind of, was it a conversation? Was it something that you saw with your co author? Like, what was the reason? I think starting off with that question is really important because I think it gives our listeners and our viewers a good understanding of why this is such an important topic to listen to.
It's a fantastic question. The Ears and Me was more of a slow burn. We've both been doing this work for, well, for me, about a decade, and in Ears' case, several decades. And we share this passion for making sure that we're not just generating knowledge for the sake of generating knowledge, but that we're actually delivering that knowledge to people on the front lines, right? Real people in real organizations who are working every day who could use these insights to do things better.
Mm,
And what we've often observed in our work with companies, when we talk to CEOs, senior leadership teams, HR, managers up and down the hierarchy, is that there's often a gap between what people are doing on the ground and the knowledge and insights that we're generating through research. Let me give you an example. One of the most popular DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion practices of the last several years has been unconscious bias training
mm,
and
mm,
other diversity trainings, which have actually been around in different forms since the 1960s. And over the course of that whole time, more than half a century, they've been extensively studied and they have been found to essentially have negligible impact on people's behaviors.
mm.
So, yes, folks often learn new things in these unconscious bias trainings. They might even rate the training a 10 out of 10 because they loved the facilitator and it was so interesting and illuminating. But then when we follow people up 6 or 18 months or more later and see, are they working differently? Are they running their meetings differently? Are they hiring different colleagues? Are different people getting promoted in the organization? We just don't see any change. So, we as researchers have been trying to tell organizations for quite a while that this might not be one of the sharpest tools in our toolbox. And there are actually other tools in our toolbox to make work fair that are much more effective and would be a more cost effective investment. So, that's one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book, is to deliver the latest and greatest, the most rigorous information on what actually works and what doesn't, what are all the different tools that you have available in your toolbox, and which tools are best suited for which situations. And the book landed in the world at a time that we couldn't have envisioned, right? How topical these themes are. There's a lot of conversation right now about, is DEI dead? What's the
Mm.
future of DEI? And so we actually feel quite lucky that our book landed at a moment where it can really contribute to the conversation and provide people this factual, data based roadmap for how to proceed.
That is so fascinating. And you mentioned this point that I wanted to bring up because right now, given and we're both in the US for those of because I know we have an international audience, the sentiment
Mm,
around DE&I is it's a bit different now, starting this year, right? Like, is it good? Is it bad? Is it fair? Is it not fair? Right? All these things. And I completely agree. I think the fact that we're having this conversation and your book being research backed, things that you've studied for years, I'm so curious to now ask what does work? Because you mentioned what doesn't really work. So
mm.
the question is, what does work?
Yeah. What works are small tweaks to the things that we're doing already as part of our everyday work. So, a once a year training, or a once a quarter networking session, or twice a year, bringing in speakers. Those are programs that are separated from what you do every day, right? They can be interesting, they can be motivated, they can be educational, but
Mhm.
they're not integrated into what you're already doing. So, everything, all the interventions or the solutions that have been shown to be much more effective are the ones that slightly change the work that you're already doing. So, one of my favorite studies looked at Novartis, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, and their goal was to increase the employee's sense of inclusion and specifically psychological safety,
Mhm.
which is people's willingness to take interpersonal risks, such as by going up against a senior leader or raising an unpopular opinion in a meeting, for example. And this sounds wonderful, right? We all would prefer to work in an environment that's psychologically safe, where we feel included and welcomed. But those concepts can also feel a little fuzzy. It's kind of hard to know, okay, if we're trying to increase inclusion, where would we even start? And a lot of companies would say, okay, let's do a workshop and let's train people. So what I love about Novartis's approach is that they instead tackled one of these everyday actions that people are already doing, which is one on one meetings between managers and their direct reports. And they ran an experiment where they tested various different guidelines for managers on how to conduct these meetings. And it turns out there was one guideline that was by far the most effective at both increasing inclusion and psychological safety, But also, interestingly, it was effective at increasing the frequency of these meetings. And now everybody's wondering, okay, so what was this guideline? It was shockingly simple. It invited managers to speak less in the meeting, listen more, and give control to their direct report to surface their needs and aspirations so that the manager could then kind of figure out, okay, how can I help you? How can I remove roadblocks? And how can I best support you? So, something as simple as tweaking how we conduct these one on one meetings that are happening regularly already can make a huge difference, not only for better communication, by the way, in this case, which I know, Jessica, you're such an expert in and your listeners are really interested in, but also surprisingly for things like how included people feel, how welcoming they feel the environment is to their ideas, especially if those ideas are contrary to what's happening today.
I'm smiling because that just makes me so happy to hear. And a lot of times it really is as simple as it is. Sometimes we try, when organizations are trying to like tackle a problem, they think it has to be this whole complex solution. And your point is no, actually, it's really just making sure the manager knows talk less, listen more. And just that one small
Yeah,
shift can create that more, in your words, inclusive environment that we all know is so important. And,
exactly.
you linked it to communications, and which I love because it does come down a lot to, the space that we create, which a lot of it is the communications, the space we create for other people of whether or not they feel comfortable to share their thoughts. And it makes total sense, right? When you're in a conversation, a one-on-one conversation with your manager, for a lot of us, and within like an Asian culture, because I'm Asian, right? We tend to just be very deferential, right? We let our manager just
Mm,
talk, 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 right? And we don't say much at all. And as a result of that, we might not feel like we're really a part of the conversation. And a lot of times, because we have that more deferential mentality, we won't necessarily try to say too much. But from what you're saying, from a manager's point of view, if you allow us, I'm just saying it from us point of view, if you allow
sure.
us to talk, wow, like how much more welcoming would, for example, I feel in that meeting, right? It completely changes the sentiment, the dynamic in that. It's interesting because when I was
Exactly.
listening to you talk about this, I was thinking about, our listeners and our viewers and how this tip of making work fair and a simple strategy like that could really change it. But what if a person is in an environment where they don't feel like quote unquote work is fair for them? Like having a
Yeah.
manager who has what you just said, who does that, amazing. But what if their manager doesn't do that? What if their manager doesn't create that space for them? What do you do?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And there is this tension between, the real solution is to change the systems that govern how we work, whether it's how we run our meetings or how promotion decisions get made, or whether who gets parental leave and for how long, right? Like those are the organizational systems that we need to change in order to level the playing field. At the same time, while some of those changes are quick and easy, some of them take a long time. And so, in the meantime, many of us have to navigate a system that today is unfair. So, how do we do that? One of my suggestions is always to try to become what Iris and I in the book call norm entrepreneur. It's a term that was actually originally coined by a colleague, Cass Nelstein at Harvard. But a norm entrepreneur is someone who shapes norms and expectations in a positive direction so as to create the kind of culture that you want to see. So, super simple example. If your team today, you have some team that you meet with regularly, and in your team meetings, interruptions are a common practice. Research actually shows that women are significantly more likely than men to get interrupted in meeting settings. You might become a norm entrepreneur to try to shift the norm away from interrupting and toward letting people finish respectfully by interrupting the interrupter next time. So next time you hear or see someone interrupted, you can chime in and say, "Oh, James, I look forward to hearing your point, but can we please let Jessica finish first?" And that little small intervention that you just made sends a signal not just to James, but everyone in the meeting that, hey, an interruption that just happened, it might not be the most optimal way of behaving. And the next person who wants to go interrupt another colleague is less likely to do so because they now know that they're more likely to get called out for it. either by you or someone else. And this is the power of norms. They are those shared but often unspoken understandings of what kind of behavior is acceptable or expected. Because we humans have a fundamental drive to belong and to be accepted by the group that we're in. We want to follow the herd rather than move away from the herd. And so each of us as individuals has this power to shape the norms through how we ourselves behave and through the signals that we send about what's okay and what's not. So that's one thing I think everyone can do, regardless of how fair their workplace is today, to start try to nudge things in a more positive direction.
That's so interesting. And you're basically saying you welcome interruption. Like, I encourage you to interrupt the interrupter, right? And I think about how scary, though, that can be for a lot of people, whether
Mhm.
it's because, can I do that? Is it going to come off as disrespectful, right? And I think it's easier. I mean, I would imagine, like, if you are a manager, to let somebody know, like, hey, hold on a second, let this person finish their thought. But if you're just kind of like the same level, let's say, as like your colleague, is
Mm.
that okay to do? I mean, like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know
Yeah,
there's a lot of fear.
there's definitely an intersection with power dynamics here, and I think people who feel in any given setting that they are the more powerful or more senior, right, or have more authority, um, they kind of feel more at ease doing whatever they want to do. It's hard from the outside to tell. I think you are always the best judge of any situation that you find yourself in because you know the people involved the best, you know the context, you know the backstories.
Mhm,
But what another way, if you don't feel comfortable intervening in front of everybody, let's say that someone made a sexist joke or an off-color comment that you feel uncomfortable with, and you want to do something about it, right? Because you don't want those things to continue, but you don't feel comfortable in the meeting in front of this large group of people kind of calling the offender out. Well, you have alternatives. One thing you could do is take that person aside one on one after the fact and say, hey, listen, I didn't love what you said about X, or it sounded to me like, right? Just kind of raise it to their attention. If you even don't feel comfortable with that, ask around with a few peers to say, did you hear what I just heard? Am I crazy, or was that really not okay? Then maybe approach HR or
mhm,
approach another senior person with whom you have a more trusting and comfortable relationship to say, this is what happened in the meeting. I really didn't agree, but I don't feel comfortable taking the offender to task. Might you be able to help me resolve this somehow? But it's those small daily moments where we either create a culture where those sexist comments are tolerated or not. So, it's creating and upholding a good culture is hard work. But if we're not willing to do it, then I don't know if we get to complain about working in a bad culture. People say, oh, the culture here is terrible. My first question would be, okay, so what have you done to make it better? How have you tried to shift it in a positive direction? Because the reality is, each of us contributes to the culture of an organization, either by doing something actively, like complimenting colleagues, giving credit, or alternatively saying offensive things, or then we contribute to the culture passively by letting things slide. But either way, we're contributing to the culture.
I love how you're in many ways empowering individuals, that they have
Mhm.
the power to change the way the workplace culture is, right? And I think sometimes it's easy for us to just be like, it's fine, it's whatever, let me just focus on my work, right? But I think, like, if we want to create that healthy environment, it's all these little things even that you're saying, right? That can make a huge difference. And even though you're just like, maybe it won't make a difference, I truly think it starts with the little things that can eventually increase into the bigger changes, the bigger movements. Now, one of the questions
Totally.
that came up to my mind is, you know, and this is kind of getting down to like the individual level where, and I've heard this myself, where people will say the word, I feel like work isn't fair because my manager plays favorites, or work
Mm,
isn't fair because I'm working just as hard as my colleague, but they're getting all the recognition. So therefore,
mm.
I don't feel like it's fair. So when people come up to you and they ask you that question, how do you respond? Like, what do you say? What advice would you give?
Mm. So, if you're in a position to collect data on things, my first piece of advice would be to say, let the data speak. So, something like pay. And I know this is not one of the examples that you mentioned, but I'll give it anyway. Um, a lot of people feel like they're underpaid, right? Actually, everyone feels like they should be paid more. That's kind of a common human refrain. Whenever you ask people, are you satisfied with your pay? The answer is always no, I want more. Sometimes people might actually be underpaid. And sometimes people actually are paid in line with what colleagues with similar experience and roles are being paid. You won't know unless you look at the data, not just for yourself, but for the whole company, right? The anonymized aggregated data to say, okay, people at this level on average are getting paid this much, and the range is from X to Y. So for companies, my advice is, or for managers, my advice is the best way to counter perceptions of unfairness is to just let the data speak and say, look, actually, let's say women are advancing on par with men. You know, women on average get promoted in 3 years from level 1 to level 2, and so do men. When you're able to show and prove in the data that this is what's going on, that can help to calibrate people's expectations. Now, if you're at the individual level, so you might not have access to that large scale data to be able to prove things either way, but you have the sense of like, wait,
Mhm.
I was part of the project team, but I'm not listed on the slide, you know? Or when the senior person from the project team presents on behalf of the whole team, they never mention any of the other contributors. Well, that's a concrete behavior that you could potentially tackle. So next time you create the slide deck for the presentation, put everyone's names on the front page.
Mhm.
Put it in the speaking notes. Suggest to the senior leader, hey, I think it would be really great if going forward, we always listed all the names of the people on the project team to ensure that everyone gets to share a little bit in the credit. Or would you consider having different members of the team present parts of the project, the ones that they spearheaded? And of course, sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes our managers and senior leaders are not receptive to those good ideas. Um, but it's worth suggesting them anyways. And maybe one leader might not be supportive, but then another leader will be really enthusiastic.
I love that. I love the 2 examples that you gave of starting with, like, from the first manager's point of view, if you're communicating it to the individual contributors, show data that, this is actually just how the landscape is. This is just what it is, right? And it's not you may perceive it as unfair, but this is the data, this is the evidence to show that actually you're on par, quote unquote, with everybody else, right? But then from an individual point of view, you're actually saying find proactive ways to just put yourself out there to ensure you are getting the credit that you deserve, right? Whether
Yeah,
it's volunteering to to present, volunteering to put something together, right? When you are proactively, I think, seeking out those opportunities, then you can much more easily put your name front and center so people notice it, right? I
yeah.
think sometimes it's so easy for us to, say like, oh, work isn't fair, but like you said, like, what are you doing about it, right? Like, are
Yeah.
you doing
It's like
anything
little
about
kids, when they just throw a tantrum and get on the floor and say, this is not fair. It's not fair. And we all have those moments at all ages when that's how we feel inside. It's totally okay to feel that way. But then you put your boss pants on and you say, well, what am I going to do about it? How could I make it a little bit more fair?
Exactly, and it's funny that you mentioned, like, the kids example because I'm just envisioning, like, kids on the playground, and I have kids too, right? When, like, let's say, like, this person got a bigger scoop of ice cream than the other, and this person's
Right.
unhappy about it, right? And it's kinda like, well, if you're unhappy about it, then what can you do? Maybe go up to the person and ask for, like, a bigger scoop, but ask nicely, right? And
Yeah.
I think you can even say, like, "Oh, I saw this person got a bigger scoop, can I have more?" Right? And I think sometimes making a case for it, right? Making a case for it
Yeah.
not being, going to like the kid's point of view, not, and I always say this to my son, don't whine, right? But just be very clear and firm, right? I think it can make a huge difference. So
Yeah.
I know you have a lot of frameworks in your book, of like, things and ways people can approach work. What's one of your favorite ones that you always love talking about that you feel is, applicable to any workplace that people can really think about and digest?
So, dovetailing on what we talked about earlier, one of my favorite quotes from the book is fairness is not a program, but it's a way of doing things. So I would leave everyone, or if there's one thing that you take away from this podcast, it would be to look at the things that you are already doing and pick one thing that you could tweak slightly to make it more fair. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the UK, from the BBC, where Roz Atkins, this gentleman has been a career journalist for 20 years, and he wanted to create journalism that's really high quality and reflective of the world that it serves. But he realized a few years ago that he had no way of knowing if his journalism was meeting that standard because he had no data on the people that he was actually reporting on. At the time, Roz was the anchor, the presenter of a nightly primetime news show. So he decided to start counting at the end of each night's show with his team. Okay, we had 60 minutes on air. During that time, how many women and how many men did we feature on screen? As expert commentators and contributors to shed light on the day's news. And they counted every night for a month, and then they averaged out their results and discovered that only 39% of the people they featured on air were women. So they said, okay, but the world is roughly 50-50. So we're really way off base here. And that led them to set themselves a target of getting to 50-50, which they in fact did in about 3-4 months. And then they stayed there for years, for as long as the program was on air. But to your earlier point, Jessica, about how a single individual, just by changing their own behavior, can actually ignite a much bigger movement for change, that's exactly what happened at the BBC. Once Roz and his team had figured out how to use data to help them create journalism that was higher quality and more representative, they then started sharing this approach with other teams at the BBC. And they said, listen, we know you're a busy, overwhelmed journalist like you. The nature of news is really unpredictable, it's constantly changing. We get it. We operate under the same constraints, but we also share the same goal of the highest quality journalism. And we figured out a really simple tool that helped us to do that. So this tool might be helpful to you as well. You might want to start counting who you feature as well. And long story short, 8 years later, this project started in 2017. More than 750 content creating teams around the BBC globally have joined what has now become known as the 50-50 Equality Project. And also more than 150 other media organizations, journalism schools, other external partner companies have joined. And it all started with one person having a super simple idea to change how they were doing their everyday work. So you never know who's going to spark a global movement for change.
I love that. And, it makes me think about how whether you're a manager or not, right? You can present an idea, an initiative like this. And
Yeah.
hey, maybe you get told no, right? The first time. Maybe you get told no the second time, or somebody says it's not a good idea, right? But I think, going to your point about having data, having evidence of why it's so important, I think it's all about building a strong case, right? A
Yeah.
lot of times the people that come to me, they always tell me and they say this word of like, I'm so afraid of rejection, right? It's why I don't
Mm,
communicate. It's why I don't want to put myself out there. It's because of this rejection, right? And one of the things that I always like to talk about is, never take no as a final answer. And I constantly reiterate this. And I think it's a perfect time to reiterate this now because, I think when people are listening to this, they're thinking about, what are some things that I can do, right? Hopefully after listening to this, people will feel very empowered, right? And you might start thinking about some ideas within your team, within your office, your workspace of like, what's something I can do to make work more fair? And maybe you have an idea, maybe you present that idea, but maybe you might get told no, right? But it's
yep.
not about taking that no and just internalizing it and maybe just going forget about it. It's thinking about, how can I take this no, but maybe present it in a different way or
Yeah.
bring it up a different time or talking to a different person, right? No is never
Then get
closed.
feedback, right? This is something that Roz did so effectively is he had a brain trust of colleagues that he was workshopping these ideas with and saying, well, what if we did it this way? What if we did it that way? So if someone tells you no on an idea, my first question would be, how could I tweak it to make a yes? Where is this no coming from? right?
Mhm.
Is it coming from, oh, it's not the right time right now, but in 6 months it could be? Or is it, well, we don't have the budget? Well, those things can change. Budgets go up and down all the time. So understand where the resistance is coming from and then plot ways to get around it. And the other thing I would also say is we have more things than we realize that we are in control of already, such that we don't need other people's no's or yeses. So sometimes the best thing is to start with something that's fully within your own sphere of control, how you run your own meetings, how you write your emails, how you manage your calendar, right? Who
Mhm.
you spend time with in the office. That's something you can track and measure. Um, and start with those things where you don't need anybody else's participation to start creating change.
What would you tell somebody who, let's say they are feeling, for example, that their workplace isn't fair, for whatever reason, and then their intuition is telling them, just leave, find a different job,
Mm.
go to a different workplace. What would you say? Is that the right solution, or is it to try to make these changes that we're talking about today?
Mm, I think only you can know in your particular situation what the right answer is and whether you think the environment that you're in right now is receptive to change. And if you worked hard, could you shift things? Or is it the case where this environment is no longer deserving of your precious time and precious talents and it's time to take them somewhere else? I think both of those can be the right solution, just depending on the exact circumstances that you find yourself in.
That's a good answer. So, one of the things I want to ask too is, was there anything surprising in your research that you found as you were writing this book? Any data, piece of evidence, stories, or anything that kind of like caught your attention?
As a researcher, I'm honestly surprised a lot, which is great because the whole point, right, is we're being curious about the world. We're trying to learn new things. But I think one thing that is kind of a consistent theme is how super small changes, for example, to how we communicate and what we say, can yield massive impacts in behavior. So, one example that I'm thinking of is one of the largest employers in Australia, which had looked at its data and identified an interesting gender gap. So when they had people internally applying for leadership roles,
Mhm.
among folks who didn't get the job at that time, men were almost twice as likely as women to reapply for a different leadership position in the future. And for the company standpoint, this was kind of a waste, right? Because the people who have applied and who are close to the top, they're really very good. We want to slot them into other leadership positions going forward, even if they weren't the right fit for this particular job at this time. So we want to keep them in the pool. So the company, in an experiment, tested a super, super small tweak to their communication. They were already emailing the top 20% of rejected candidates saying, we're so sorry you didn't get the job this time, but there's many other leadership positions open. Please reapply. So now they added one sentence into that email that accurately informed people that they were, in fact, in the top 20%. So it was, you're in the top 20% of applicants. We'd love for you to reapply for a future leadership opening. And if you can believe it, just adding that little bit of information closed the gender gap in reapplications. And women and men became equally likely to reapply. And there's a bigger lesson here, actually, that's backed up by a lot of research about how being more transparent and reducing ambiguity about what it takes to succeed and what you're required to do to advance really helps to level the playing field. So that's something that I would urge people to think about anytime you're communicating, whether it's in person or by email or you're writing a company manual or policy, is how can you make things as clear and transparent as possible? How can you reduce ambiguity as much as possible? That's one key way to make work fair across the board.
Why do you think adding that one sentence changed? Like,
Mm.
why do you think so?
Yeah. So what we saw in the data is actually women became more likely to apply and men became slightly less likely to apply. And our best guess of why this is happening, the leading hypothesis is that for women, telling them that you're in the 20% top 20% changed their calculation about whether it would be worthwhile to invest time and effort in a new application. Because when they know they're in the top 20%, they think, actually, I have a realistic shot at maybe getting the job next time. So it's worthwhile for me to go through the hassle of putting in another application. Whereas what we suspect was going on with men is that they might have actually thought they were in the top 1% or top 5% of applicants. Now, of course, that can still be true if you're in the top 20%, right? If you're in the top five, you're also at the
Mhm.
same time in the top 20. But for them, it might have almost served as a negative signal where they thought, wait, I thought I am like absolutely at the top. Now you're only telling me I'm in the top 20%. Well, I'm less likely to be interested in this. And there's a deeper lesson in this data, in this result that I think is really important, which is we often assume that whatever men are doing is the default and the correct way. So we're saying women need to be more confident to match men, or women need to be more aggressive, or more this and that, or less this and that. But there's absolutely nothing to suggest that what men are doing or what we're observing from them is the optimum way. In fact, in this instance, maybe the perfect level of reapplications was somewhere in between what women and men were doing initially. So I think we have to really be careful not to fall into that trap of assuming that men are the universal default and that
Mhm.
everyone should just be doing whatever men are doing today. And I think, Jessica, you talk about this so much in your work too with communication is just because certain people are loud doesn't mean that everyone has to be exactly as loud as them, because maybe
Mhm.
some people are being too loud.
Yes. Exactly, and I love that story, and it kinda makes me go, "Yeah, I wonder if I was looking at that application, and let's say I was applying for that leadership job, would seeing that one sentence change my own confidence?" And I think it actually would. I don't know, like, maybe something about seeing that tangible number makes me go, "Well, I was in the top 20, that's pretty good, like, let me just keep trying," right? Um,
Exactly.
and, you
Exactly.
said it perfectly, like and this is what I talk about in my book too, it's you know, many of us who are working in a global organization or in a more Western organization, there tends to be that gravitation towards the people who are most loud, right? But
Yes.
I have found that just because you're loud, it doesn't mean you are a good communicator. Just because you're loud, it doesn't mean people even listen to you, right? So
Mhm.
my whole thing with communications is how can you be smart about the way you speak, smart about the way you approach work. And I think everything that you're talking about, Siri, links beautifully to that. And I love all the tangible tips that you're sharing, the easy tips that you're
Yeah.
sharing too, right?
Yeah.
So I can't believe this, but we're about to wrap up and where
Time
can
flies when you're
people
having fun, right?
it is. So how can people get in touch with you, find more about you, get your book? Let us know where.
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so I'd love to connect with you there, Siri Chilazi. The book, once again, is called Make Work Fair, and it's available anywhere where books are sold. The website is makeworkfair.com. And on the front page there is also an opportunity to join Iris's in my newsletter, which we don't spam you. We maybe email you once a month with the latest research and the latest data and evidence on what are the concrete things that we all can do, what works, to make work more fair. Our mission is to empower people at all levels of all types of organizations everywhere in the world to help you make your own work more fair. Because when you do that, your organization becomes more fair. And that's a huge benefit to you and everyone else in the organization. So, those are the types of tips that we share in our newsletter.
Well, Siri, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with all of us. And for those of you who are watching and listening, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope you feel inspired by our conversation today. And, like I said, we host these events, every so often. Do stay in touch with us as well, because that's how we notify you all of an upcoming event. And you can do so by going to the website soulcastmedia.com/events. Or for those of you who can see this, there's a QR code on the screen. But either way, get in touch with us. Let us know what you thought of this episode. Get in contact with Siri. And with that, thank you all so much. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care, everybody.